estate there now, but there was a fork in the road and a big tree, and there was a little white hut with a very elderly lady sitting in it. That was a Chamber of Commerce. So we went inside and inquired about a place where I might be able to stay for the summer. And she said, well, you know, there's a lady up in the woods off Berwick Road, and she has a little cabin, and maybe she might rent it to you. So we both got into the car and drove just a little way up Berwick Road, and there was a left in the woods, which the water company used to get to the water tower. And Eleanor stayed in the car, and I walked up the road, and I came to this little wooden cabin in the woods among all of these ferns. It was really beautiful. And then there was a tiny little Hodgson house cabin. And Sears used to make a portable house. They made them both small and larger. It turns out that a friend of mine, Frank Perkins, later on in Moody Beach, had a large one that they built onto, and I was amazed. So I went up to the cabin, and Annabelle answered the door. And she said, I said, I'd like to be able to stay here for the summer. And she had no idea why I wanted to stay there. And she said, well, you can stay here, but you have to get a job at the Whistling Oyster. No, you had to get a job at the Dancing Fan. And I didn't quite understand why she was, because I didn't tell her that I was coming up to be painting all summer long by myself in the cabin. So I went down to the bottom of the hill and I said, you know, Eleanor, I said, this looks like a very nice little cabin, but she says I have to get a job. I had saved up enough money in high school to be able to, you know, pay for all of the summer for living there. So Eleanor went up to the cabin, and then finally, you know, Annabelle got the picture that I'd saved all this money so I could paint all summer long in Ogunquit. So that's how I got here, and most of the time, I didn't really associate in town with anyone, really. I met maybe a person here or a person there. And I would each day get up and I had an easel that you can see in the back room. There's a picture of this crazy guy with the easel on his back with the Raleigh, and that was me. And I'd get the paint box and I'd ride off somewhere, set up the easel, and paint all day. So, and Annabelle had her friends from Connecticut. She was from Connecticut. And where was it? She lived in a very nice place where there were a lot of artists. And they would all come up and visit her. And they'd like to come over to the little cabin to see what I was doing and how I was painting and what was happening. So that's really how I came to Ogunquit. And then for all of those years later, every summer I returned to the cabin, and I took care of Annabelle, took care of her. I went down to the mailbox every day, and I got the mail, and when she needed something at the market, I would bring it up for her. And but she was tremendous. She was a child psychiatrist, as it turned out, and so she understood me. So it was quite a long adventure. Every year she would drive her Volvo up from Westport, Connecticut. She had a Volvo station. She'd had that stick shift. She was tiny, and she'd hit that thing, you know, and get it going and make the air and back, and she'd make her way all the way up the top of this wooded road with large rocks and boulders. I don't know how she didn't lose the bottom of the car. But anyway, so that's what I did for quite a number of summers therein each time. Eventually, I got to associate with a few people here and there. It's an interesting, actually, Peter, right?
Peter.
Actually, Peter, Annabelle knew various people, and somehow it was arranged that I should go to a little gathering for tea at Mrs. Woodbury's house, India. So, and your dad, he was there.
Yeah.
And so I went up to the house, and I rode my bicycle up there, and they were very cordial and showed me all of the paintings that they had in the house. And there were a gathering of a variety of other people. And I had a coat like this or something. I was all dressed up, and a car was stuck in the mud. I remember that. And I got behind the car and I tried to push it. Well, I turned all mud. And it was really pretty funny. I remember that vividly. But, you know, so I got to, you know, eventually become friendly with a person or two. And also, who was it? Who used to work at the Pine Tree Gallery. And it was George Kunkel. And George Kunkel had a son. And he used to love to go down to the truck stop and take all of the license plates and make notebooks of the trucks that were coming through. And you know, that's what he ended up doing as an adult. Because when his dad died, he brought up to my cabin one of his father's pictures. But you all remember the Pine Tree Gallery?
No.
Well, I know so much is gone now. It's just, it's kind of, anyway, when you're coming into town, there's a big place that has storage on the left.
Yes.
It's all storage up there. Well, the Pine Tree Gallery, Chris Ritter,
Yes.
who was an artist, who designed the Barn Gallery, had opened up designed also a beautiful two-part building up in the woods at the top of the road. And out front of the road was a big sign that said Pine Tree Gallery. And Chris used to exhibit all of the works of local artists in the area. And George worked in that building and framed, helped him frame. And it was very interesting because Chris was not much of a businessman. He was an architect and an artist by nature. But he had this gallery with all these art supplies on one side and people exhibited on the other. But I'd go in and I'd say, well, you know, how much is this roll of canvas? And I'd go, ow, I don't know, $20. But no, I don't think he knew what anything cost, but if you were there and willing, he would sell it to you. Name your price. So I remember the Pine Tree Gallery with a lot of fondness, and at that time in Ogunquit, it was a different place. More people come up to a town, the larger it gets, the more influx of a kind of a commercialism, and a lot of the intimacy can be lost. And in Ogunquit and downtown, there were always a lot of artists to be seen, painting on corners. There were even some art galleries right in the center of the town. And then you had John Vignari across the street with his two children. He painted these big exotic canvases of sailboats and floral and Floridian scenes. And so there were, down Shore Road, there were a lot of Bartok was there, and there were various people. But I finally got to know Ted Jaslow. We became very friendly. And we had a lot of good times together. And it was at Ted's place I got to see the first cable TV upstairs. We had a lot of interesting times. In fact, Ted and I and your mom Elizabeth used to always go down to Bessie's in the morning, and we'd all sit there and we'd have a great time because Ted he had a great knowledge of art history, and he read a lot, and your mom did too, Mrs. Lambert. And so we had a wonderful time in the morning. I haven't done anything like that since, really. But people have a tendency every morning to go someplace where they can kind of talk and they meet their friends and see how the day is going and what's going to happen, So that was a very interesting part of my time in Ogunquit. And then I joined the Barn Gallery, and I was talked into being the president of the place for a year, or maybe it was 2 years. And so that was interesting too. And so for a long time, I've been a member. I still am a member of the gallery. Where's Vivian? Did we pay our dues yet, Vivian? There were a lot of people. I got to know Ogunquit through the Barn Gallery probably more than in any other way or manner. And Annabelle had a friend who lived in a cottage just around the pathway, which was part of the High Rock Hotel at one time. And the tennis courts were there. And so I used to, Annabelle would invite Mrs. Gray over to play Scrabble. And then at night, I would have to come over to Annabelle's and escort Mrs. Gray back to her cabin through the darkness. And I would do that. And each night I would escort her back. Mrs. Gray would go, she was cheating over. They were very, very competitive. And so I would bring her back. And then I got to know Mrs. Gray's, family, her daughters and their husbands and the boys and the whole thing. And they collected works of art of mine over the years. I actually sold a number of paintings through Annabelle and Mrs. Gray and so forth. It was an interesting a time. It was from 1968 mostly to 19 88 or something. What is the book? So what was this timing
To
on that?
present.
I mean, I still, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm here, but I actually lived, you know, in the cabin every summer. But that's a little bit of how I got to Ogunquit and meeting all the wonderful people here, which it's still, there's still a core of people and of memories that still reside and exist here in the town. And more so often in the off season than in the, and I lived here. I actually took care of my art teacher, Eleanor Marvin, who had driven me up here in 1968. And in 1990, I moved here with her and Mr. Marvin, who had Parkinson's, and he was not well. So I helped take care of Mr. Marvin with her. And then we lived here up in Berwick Road and made lots of works of art. A lot of my woodcuts were really done at that point in time. I really started working on the reduction woodcut in the 80s, mid 80s. More so, I used to paint outside every day in the daytime, but I began to really become much more involved in the idea of the reduction woodcut because of the constructivism of it. And I tell people I'm really not a picture maker. I don't make pictures, but what I have is ideas about things. And I like to realize them in the form of equations of color and light and dark and texture. And I like the process of the printmaking because it reveals to you while you're doing it. You're almost collaborating with the medium itself, because when you draw a cut on the block, you don't really know what you have. You think you do. It's not until you ink that block up and you peel the paper off the block that it tells you what you did. So it has an amazing, a lot of mystery to it. Whereas if you're painting and you paint outdoors, you see right now what you're doing and what's happening, and so you follow, you know, moment by moment what's happening. But with the printing medium, you have that space and distance and mystery. And I like the construction, the idea. There are a few little blocks in the room there that show you what it's a relief print. When you cut into the block, you ink the surface, put the paper on the surface. What's on the surface prints. I mean, I guess it's like a grave rubbing in a way. If you can, it's something you're familiar with, you know. So it's a relief printing process. So I got very involved in the reduction woodcut, which is even more complex because rather than having multiple blocks, each holding one color in the print, where you ink up the block one color, you put the paper on that, then you ink the block up another color, put the same piece on that. So each block holds a part of the design. Reduction woodcut, which I have in that room, is when you have a single block, you have to make a determination beforehand how many will exist. And you have to register all of your paper so that it falls in the block the same place every time, so the colors will register. And the reason you do that is because you're going to lay a color on the block, you're going to print the edition, which might be 30, the number that will exist. Then you'll wash that color off the block, look at your design under the color, and cut every part of that design where you want that white to remain. If you cut it, it won't print. So what you do is you may cut where you want the white to be in the design, then you might ink up the block a light blue. Now you have a light blue sheet of color with white areas. Then you look at your design and cut where you want the light blue to remain. So you're making windows for each color that you print, so that at the end the block gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the colors get more and more and more. It's kind of like painting one of those Russian eggs, you know. So once you make the print and it's finished, you can't reproduce it because obviously all of the block, a lot of it is gone. You can't really do it over. So the prints themselves are very rare in that their numbers are very small and they can't be reproduced. So that's been my main area of interest. Of course, more than anything else, drawing is the most important thing. Drawing is everything. And as an aside, there's an interesting, we found out, we did a little homework. Annabelle, many years ago, told me that Mr. Bonet in his studio would have afternoon tea every Sunday. Do you all know who Mr. Bonet is, the artist? He was an artist in Ogunquit, you know, during the 40s, 50s, 60s. Well, he had a white peaked studio at the very tip of the marginal way before you came around the bend into the cove. So with a white house with a beautiful big window, north light window. That was Mr. Bonet's studio. And as it turned out, we did some research, Vivian and I, and he lived in New York, and he came to Ogunquit, and the address was there, everything. And that white peak studio, which no longer is there, was torn down a year ago. And it was this gorgeous building. So I thought that was really, really interesting to find that out. And we were hoping that they would never tear it down. I've done a couple of drawings of it. I haven't done a woodcut of it, but it no longer exists. So I don't know what I can add at the moment. My brain is slowing down a little bit. But what I could do is invite any questions that anyone might have with regards to, Ogunquit experience. Peter?
Well, since you have to work on the block in reverse,
That I don't think.
where do you start, or how do you start so that it comes out right?
Well, that doesn't matter. Okay, the fact that it's right or left is of no consequence to me. The only thing about the woodcut that you have to understand is you're never working backwards. You're just working in negative and positive. What's relieved is going to print, what's not isn't. Once in a while, I make a determination that I'd like the scene to look as it does in reality, in life. So what I'll do is make a drawing, I'll flip it, transfer it to the block, so that when the print prints, the house goes back to the right side, as people are accustomed to seeing it, So sometimes I don't even bother doing that, but I have been more conscientious about doing that of late. I don't know why. I don't want people to be guessing too hard about where I am or what. Where was that scene from? And it looks familiar, but I can't quite, get it. And
Why do you have to know how many you want to work, you want to produce before you start?
the reason is because if you don't determine that in the beginning, you can't, you're not going to have that many prints. Because you're cutting and printing, cutting and printing, cutting and printing, cutting and printing. That's why you can't reproduce it. You have to simultaneously addition as you make the print. You see? Because you're losing the block between each color.
Got it.
At the end, you might have a block which is largely interesting if you ink it up. There's a lot of the block still left. Now, I've actually sold some woodcuts of the last state because there was enough there, so that it was really interesting for an architect, if somebody interested in structures but to get back to the idea of a work of art or even music, painting and drawing is the end result. It isn't. It's not a picture. It doesn't have to be something that you recognize as you imagine it is. It can end up that way. A lot of great painting is not recognizable to people because they're seeing it with the wish for an image, a picture that they're familiar with. The more familiar with the painting and drawing you are, the less necessarily you need of that, because generally artists work in the abstract. And if they don't, then they become more picture makers. They're illustrating. Oftentimes people will come into the gallery, my gallery, and they may be, it may be for them a process of confirmation. They're trying to look in the walls to confirm that what's on the walls is what they know and what's in their head and what they think a painting or drawing is, rather than an experience of discovery, where all of a sudden they're going to look in the wall and see it and say, well, I've never seen it that way. I never thought about it that way. So there are ways of being able to see that you're not accustomed to. And that's much more imaginative, much more inventive. And it's more the idea of working about how you feel about things rather than how things look. And so there is no realism really in a sense. And it's the same with music. Music is a gathering together of sounds. They may not be melodies and they may not be sounds that you're familiar with, but that doesn't mean that they're not beautiful if they're made in an arrangement that you're not familiar with, but you can become familiar with it. But it's an arrangement of sounds, and drawing and painting is an arrangement of colors and textures, etc. So, you know, the more you can think, I think that way, the more open you'll be to be able to, you know, imagine and enjoy things. But it's very hard when you're in a kind of a, it's the most difficult thing is to Paul Gauguin, you know, was a great artist. And Paul Gauguin said the most difficult thing for him was to be able to unlearn everything he learned. Because we have a tendency to become very confined in our understanding of things. We see things through a lens, which is established. That we think we know what things. When somebody says, I know what I like, that means they're probably never going to learn anything. You know, it's done. You know, they can see it. If they like it, they do. If they can't, they don't. You know.
Thank you. Yeah, this is interesting. I remember in high school, I don't see myself as having artistic ability in terms of painting and things like that. Maybe floral arrangements, but I had this great art teacher in history, and she had us make prints. I don't think it was wood. I think it was some
Linoleum,
sort of
probably.
Linoleum
Yeah.
or rubber.
Yeah,
And
linoleum.
then I wanted to know, like, you know, we would rub the paint on with a roller, like a small
Yeah,
roller.
rare, yeah.
And then you put the paper and
Yeah.
then take the print.
Yeah.
And it is cool how it does reveal to you, and I just wanted to see if any of that was similar to what you.
It's exactly what I do.
Yeah.
My brayer, instead of that big, is that big. And, but it's the same principle. And you ink up the block, and what I do is I do my big prints through an etching press, which is a large steel roller in the bottom, a smaller, heavier one on the top with a steel bed that goes underneath it. And you regulate the pressure of the roller to go down or up according to the thickness of the template. So I'll ink up the block, get the registration, get the you know, the pressure right, then put blankets on or board or paper, and then put it through the press. And then the pressure of the steel roller will pull the ink off the paper. So you pull it back out. So every one of the woodcuts is all hand pulled, and it takes a while, you know, it probably takes 15 or more minutes just to pull one print of a block. And then you have to do the addition when you're printing. If you do 30, if I do a wood block and it's 10 colors, and the addition is 30, I have to print the block 300 times. So my shoulders are wearing out. Yeah. So, yeah.
Do you want to see the new press?
Oh yeah, you could bring one out. Yeah, bring it out. There are two of them, and you won't be able to tell the difference between the two, because there's so much going on in a lot of these woodcuts. You don't know. Sometimes when a person purchases a print, I may spread out, which is kind of confusing. I may spread out like 4 or 5 prints. And all of a sudden, if they're really careful, they can tell the difference between each one. But a lot of the times, they can't. This is a woodcut that I just finished. It has to do with the Perkins Cove, the back of the cove. I mean, the back of the river. And I'm still working on the print, actually. But what I did is when I first printed this, all of the background of Ogunquit was still there. And then I made a determination that I would cut out the background to send it further back. So I cut out all the background and then printed the block again. And so there's a way you can bring things back and forth and change color, and there's a lot of things you can do with the wood block. It is a lot of plasticity to it. But so it's actually a 9-color print. And it was a woodcut which I started in Gloucester. And we had a fire at the Beacon Marine, and fortunately, the building's over 150 years old. Fortunately, on the right side, it was just an apartment or two that got burned. So we had some smoke damage. And I had, fortunately, 3 interns. And they came from various schools, and they spent their summer really restoring works. And we got to be able to clean all the glass and take a lot of the prints were in flat files. They were saved because of that, and so forth. So I didn't lose very much work, but I didn't have this finished, so I worked another month and a half or so on it to get it to a point where it reached this point of conclusion. So that's what this is a big block. It takes a lot of time and effort to do it, to construct it. So yeah, that's good, Vivian. Yeah, you can.
So which one is the final?
Well, I still might add a color. I might add another color. I might lighten. Yeah. I keep if I can do something more, I usually do it. And not always, so that's not always a positive thing. But what I try to do is put more and more interest into smaller and smaller areas, so that when you look at the print, it's hopefully more enjoyable to the eye to be able to see into areas where things are happening. That's why the print sometimes can be viewed for a long period of time, because it takes time to discover it, bit by bit, because of what the artist has done over a period of time. And it's not dissimilar to music. If you hear music by a person, a great colorist of music, or a person who knows the orchestra and the colors it can produce, the sounds. So what some artists will do, it could be Maurice Ravel, it could be Rimsky-Korsakov, but they have this buffet of color, of organization of sounds. And sometimes you think one instrument is making a sound, and it might be 3 different instruments. They give it beautiful tonality and subtlety. So, and then, if you look into orchestras, sometimes there'll be 6 horns, and 2 of them are playing at one time, then there are 4, and back to 1, right, Heinz? Heinz is a singer, and Heinz, but I got that here too. And so Heinz also has the biggest collection of French horns I've ever seen, up like this, all strung up. But so we have the interest in music also as well. So
Are
let's
you
see.
still playing as much classical music
Oh
as you ever did?
My brother, Lee de, do you know Lee de Valliere? Lee de Valliere? Lee de Valliere was part of Ogunquit Performing Arts, and we had a board which organized all of the concerts at the, we call it the Great House at the Town Hall, the Great Hall at the Town Hall. But we do concerts, classical music concerts, and Lee was on the board, and he was a pianist. And so he used to do a lot of concerts here in Ogunquit with the Bwins. There was a barn, and everyone used to do concerts up in the woods, and it was a little different kind of an environment at that time. And Lee played the piano. He had it in his house, and he passed away not long ago. What was it, Ralph? Like a year, half a year?
Month?
Lee de Valliere, and so he was a big collector of music. So Ralph saw his son on the road, and the son came in and he said, we have all of this music, do you want it? So Ralph he has an enormous collection. I have like 6 or 7 unpacked boxes of CDs of classical music. So I need to buy some bookcases. But I listen to them all. I play music all the time while I'm working.
Last week I saw the Portsmouth Symphony Orchestra.
Somebody else told me that about an hour ago.
Well, it wasn't me.
Yeah, no, I know, yeah.
And John Page is the conductor.
Mm-hmm.
And he does a speech before it begins and gives a little hindsight into it all. And he was playing Elgar.
Enigma Variations.
Enigma Variations,
Yeah.
of which there are 14. And he continued to say to the entire audience, this is all about color.
Mm-hmm.
Music is art.
Yeah.
And he sees it all as he conducts visually
Mm-hmm.
as a painting in color.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about feeling and emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Less about sound, more about color.
Yeah.
And it was very impressive to hear that.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting insight. The one thing about the visual arts that separates it from music, or the kind of music that we're accustomed to, in that, not to be cynical, but you can fake the people out in the visual arts. You can do it. In music, you have to be able to play the instrument. And if you can't, it's obvious. So there's a certain inherent discipline in music that it requires that technical skill to be able to make the sounds as they're written on a page. There are notes, and you need to be able to make the notes. So there's a little bit of a difference between the two. And the one I think is in some ways easier. The visual is a little easier than having to be making the notes.
You have to know what you're doing.
Yeah. In any case, yeah. Any questions? Any other?
Don?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say, when I was working at the Barn Gallery, when you had your show,
Oh yeah.
think 2006 maybe.
Dude, you got a good memory.
Yeah, because Mariah was there working
That's
with me.
right, yeah.
And you had your show, and we enjoyed spending time together, spending a lot of time just looking at your pieces, and then would say, look at that, wow, look at this. So all these things would kind of start to come out of your painting that we were your print work that we really enjoyed. So just to reflect back to what you were saying a few minutes ago, it was really fascinating. We saw things that, you know, just kind of browsing through, neither of us would have seen. But having more time and seeing it together and commenting it together was really a treat.
Yeah, that is it. Thank you very much. I have I enjoy that as well in the music analysis. You know, there's not many people who ever existed that could actually sit down and describe to a listener what was happening in the music. And Bernstein had an extraordinary ability. And I listened to him one time take apart the first movement of the Brahms First Symphony. And when you listen, casually, everything is taken for granted. And when you see him start to take that apart, the smallest nuance and themes, Brahms was like a musical mason. He constructed these things incredibly, and the way it was all built, same thing. You know, and sometimes and I even like it when, like in the reduction woodcut, sometimes I may have 3 or 4 colors down. Where's Brigitte? Brigitte? Where'd she go?
I'm here.
Once in a while, Brigitte looks at my work, and she does these fantastic paintings with these beautiful colors and areas of tones and everything. And I've got like 4 colors down, and then I'm going to do some more, and she goes, "Don't do any more! You do too much! You go too far!" But the same thing happens if you can hear an orchestra practicing, and he says, "I just want to hear the strings," you know, or "I just want to hear the brass," and you can sit there and you go, "Wow, you know, you just love hearing the strings. You know, let's just not do any more, you know, or just the percussion or what have you." So it's fun to see things disassemble and then reassemble. And that's what visual art really is, or any art in a way, is taking things apart and reassembling, maybe in a different way than they were originally conceived, and adding to them, you know, your feelings and ideas about them, of experience. So yeah, that's very interesting. Anybody have any other questions? Are there any? I know I'll remember a lot of things. I don't like to be too long about my conversation, but there are many memories of Ogunquit and moments. I know the Ogunquit Museum, we have 7 or 8 works in the Ogunquit Museum of American Art. The first one was collected by Michael Culver, who was here for many years. And he used to do really magnificent shows. And Michael was very conscientious. He was conscious about who the artists were who were working in Ogunquit in the area. And I'm not sure that exists now, but he was. And I find the same thing in Cape Ann, at the Cape Ann Museum, is that at Cape Ann Museum, when you're an artist and you're working there, they're very conscious of who you are and what you're doing. In fact, they're extremely area conscious. In fact, all of the shows and exhibitions, and they have an enormous collection, and they can afford to have the attitude they do because of that. And that is that most all of their shows are people who worked or visited Gloucester and painted there. Even if they visited and went, they still are not, people are very aware of that. And so all of their shows are largely Gloucester area, area-centric. And actually they're having a show starting in July of Edward Hopper's paintings in Gloucester. And it's going to be 60 works. And he painted several years. That's where he met his wife, in Gloucester. And so this is going to be a pretty large exhibition. But the thing about Cape Ann is that they have an awareness of who works and who's in the area. And I remembered Michael had that to a very large extent, and so forth. But, well, that be said, I'm asking too much. Anybody have any questions? So all of you largely